Sylvester Stallone sat in his usual chair at one of the most prestigious hotels in New York. The city was still in twilight, and the streetlights reflected off his windows. His gaze was calm, but there were subtle traces of fatigue in his eyes. He had been in the public eye for over 10 years, experiencing various stages of fame, rises and falls, but no interview had been as difficult as this one. The young reporter, named Tim, prepared to ask questions that seemed to stir even Stallone. He wasn't in a hurry, trying to look composed. As usual, reporters tried to learn more about the actor's personal life, his path to fame, and, of course, his secret to success. "Sylvester, you've become a legend. What do you think was the factor that helped you achieve all of this?" Tim asked, smiling, trying to be professional. Sylvester leaned back in his chair, his voice low and confident. "God. It's all Him. I don't think I could have done this on my own. Only because of Him do I keep going." Tim raised his eyebrows slightly in surprise. He knew that this answer would soon become a headline, but he wasn't prepared for this question to become such a challenge. "But you've achieved so much on your own," Tim replied. "Your work, your movies, your fight against fate." Sylvester smiled gently, shifting his gaze a bit. "I know you want to hear something different, but the truth is, I can't take all the credit. I had moments when I doubted myself, when no one believed in me. I went through hardships, even when everything around me said it was impossible. But if it weren't for my faith, if it weren't for my trust in what I do, I wouldn't have made it." Tim paused for a moment. Stallone's response wasn't typical for an interview, where actors and celebrities are usually credited for their success solely based on work and dedication. But Stallone spoke seriously, and his words carried more depth than just another phrase. "You often talk about the hard times when it felt like everything was lost. Would you say your faith in God became the driving force that pulled you out of the darkness?" "Yes, it was my salvation," Stallone replied, his gaze becoming more focused. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't understand that there's more than just me. I'm not just talking about my work or career, but about my life, about how I lived through every moment. And even when the situation got tough, I held on to that faith, to that feeling that there's meaning in everything I do." Tim realized that this interview was going to be more than just a conversation about success. It was filled with deeper meaning, and every word carried a life lesson. And then, just when the tension reached its peak, an unexpected moment occurred. The entire room where the interview was taking place suddenly became almost silent, and Sylvester seemed to sense it. He looked at Tim intently, and his face became serious. "You know, Tim," he said, his voice becoming softer, "a lot of people say that success is all about your work. But I'll tell you one thing. True success starts when you stop chasing it and start walking toward what you have inside." Tim leaned forward with interest, though he didn't fully understand what Stallone was trying to say. "And it's not just about me," Stallone continued. "It's about each one of us. The story of anyone who struggles, who faces failure, and who chooses the path of respect and faith. People usually want everything right now, but the truth is, change only comes when you choose to stand, even when everyone else falls." Tim understood that he wasn't just sitting in front of a celebrity. He was sitting in front of a person who had endured unspeakable hardships, but managed to keep his soul intact. The interview continued, but the atmosphere was no longer light. This was a moment when the main subject wasn't just answering questions, but revealing a part of himself, not just as an actor, but as someone who had gone through real trials and found a path to inner peace. And though the interview was coming to an end, Tim no longer asked the usual questions. He wanted to hear more about what Sylvester had to say about how he managed to withstand countless difficulties. "I don't just walk," Sylvester said at the end, when the camera was turned off. "I will keep walking, even when this path is the darkest. And in that there is strength, even if it's not always visible." These words marked the beginning of a new conversation, the beginning of a change in the hearts of those who hear and understand the depth of this faith. Sylvester Stallone was sitting at the table, with a microphone, laptop, and a large screen in front of him displaying the interviewer, a young man who looked serious and professional. The huge hall where the press conference was taking place was warmly lit, but the atmosphere, compared to what was happening on stage, was tense. "Sylvester," the journalist began, "we discussed your success on stage. But there's a question that many of our viewers are curious about. How did you achieve such a level of success? What allowed you not only to become a legend of cinema, but also to stay on top in such changing and unpredictable times?" Sylvester paused for a moment, sinking into his memories. His appearance was calm, yet his eyes carried a deep gaze. He seemed to briefly recall the tough years when everything wasn't as it is now. But he knew that now was not the time for regret or boasting. "Well," he replied in a soft but confident voice, "it wasn't an easy road. Let's just say, everyone has their moments when everything seems hopeless. But I'll tell you this, and it's the truth. I've achieved a lot because of faith. Not just faith in myself, but faith in God." The journalist, who seemed to expect a more detailed response, leaned slightly forward. He was intrigued. Stallone continued, "Many people say success comes from hard work, from a struggle. But that's only part of the story. You know, when I took my first steps in Hollywood, I was rejected. They didn't want to cast me. And it wasn't just because of my appearance, but because of my fight for every opportunity. But I believed in God, in His timing. And not just in Him helping me become a better actor. I believe that when you're given a chance, you need to be ready to accept it and do your best." The journalist made another note on his tablet, seemingly searching for a way to steer the conversation back to questions related to Stallone's professional work. But Sylvester wasn't rushing. "This is important," he continued, "because success doesn't always depend on how much you work, but on how much you're willing to invest in being the best at every moment of your life. I'll tell you more. Every step I've taken has been aimed at achieving something great, but I wouldn't have done it without relying on God. All these years, I did everything I could, but He showed me the way, how I could keep my faith and keep moving forward." The journalist seemed slightly surprised. This wasn't what he had expected. Instead of just hearing about hard work, struggle, or experiences on set, Stallone was delving deep into matters of faith. "Could you be more specific about how this faith influenced your career?" the journalist asked, trying to understand how this aspect could be connected to his success in business and cinema. Stallone calmly smiled, shaking his head slightly. He answered, "I always believed that God doesn't give you greater difficulties than you can handle. But it's important for you to learn to take responsibility for your choices. So, when I faced problems, I didn't just leave them to God's will. I fought, but at the same time, I knew that my decisions and how I reacted to difficulties were also part of His plan." The interviewer listened attentively, becoming more interested in how this attitude could have helped Stallone in his success. But before asking the next question, he paused for a moment. The room was silent. Stallone sat calmly, looking at him intently. "Maybe I got a little sidetracked, but in my life, there were always moments when I couldn't see the way forward. And I wouldn't have made it through those moments without faith. That's been my main guide." And then, as if hinting at the deeper meaning of what he was about to say, Sylvester continued, "You asked how I did it. It wasn't just my talent. It was a journey where I constantly discovered new horizons for myself. God gave me opportunities, I just didn't miss them. I went toward what was important to me." The journalist took a deep breath. It seemed to him that he had entered a deeper dimension of this conversation. He asked, "Do you think this approach could change how others view their careers?" "Absolutely," Sylvester replied. "But it's important to remember that change comes only when you're ready to accept it. Sometimes it's just a matter of timing and faith." The interview continued, and the atmosphere became increasingly intimate and profound. The journalist understood that this conversation could turn into more than just a standard interview, but a real revelation for the audience. So he decided to delve into another important topic. "Sylvester," he began. "You always appear before the public as a strong, confident man. But are there moments when you feel doubt or fear?" he asked, observing the actor's reaction. Sylvester smiled, as if sensing that this question had struck at his true core. He leaned back in his chair and paused. "Yes, of course," he replied. "Every one of us goes through moments of doubt. And I'm no exception. Especially in my youth. When you're just starting out, you don't know if anything will work. Sometimes it feels like you're walking in the dark, not knowing where you're heading. But the important thing is not to give up. That's why I always tell people, when you feel fear or doubt, it's okay. The worst thing you can do is stop. If you're not moving forward, you can't change the situation." The journalist wrote down every word, now with no doubt. This interview had turned into a life lesson. He asked the next question, trying to shift toward a more personal note. "Your career has been long, and you've become an icon. How do you handle the pressure of being a role model for others? Are there times when you feel that it's difficult to maintain that status?" Sylvester considered the question. All these years in Hollywood, numerous roles and shoots, fans, the press, it was a whole world. But he wasn't just an actor. He was someone who constantly tried to be honest with himself. "It's tough," he confessed, "because there's always this expectation from others that you will always be on top. People expect perfection from you. They want to see you as strong and invincible. But let me tell you the truth. I'm not perfect, and I'm not always strong. There are times when I feel tired too, when I feel like I can't go on. But that's part of what we do. We just keep going, even when dark days come." The journalist nodded, impressed by his honesty. He decided to shift the focus of the interview and delve into more philosophical questions, which would likely resonate with a wider audience. Looking at everything you've been through, how do you define success? What is a true achievement for you? Sylvester looked at the microphone in front of him, and his face reflected a slight thoughtfulness. "For me, success is not awards and not money, although of course they are an important part. But true success is when you can stand before the mirror and not be ashamed of who you are. When you realize that you're leaving something behind that's more than just a movie or a role. It's what stays in people's hearts. Success is when you live with the feeling of having fulfilled your duty." The journalist nodded thoughtfully. He felt that these words could serve as inspiration for many. "You said that success is not just money and awards, but also leaving something more. Do you believe that our purpose in life is to make the world a better place? To leave a mark that will positively affect others?" Sylvester responded without hesitation, his voice becoming more calm and measured. "Yes, I believe in that. And it's part of what makes our lives important. Each of us has the ability in our hearts to change the world, even if it seems like a small step. I've always tried to inspire people to be better, to not give up, even when everything around you says it's impossible. If you want to leave the world better, you have to start with yourself, with how you treat others." The room was silent, listening to every word. The journalist felt that this moment had become the climax of their conversation, and before asking the last question, he paused. "How do you see your future? What else do you want to achieve?" Sylvester looked at the camera and smiled. "We all should strive for a better future. I can't say I want to do something special. I will keep moving forward, helping others, and believing that every day is a new chance for change." This was what made Sylvester Stallone a true icon, not just his roles in film, but his life philosophy, his belief in people, and the very possibility of changing the world. The interview continued, and with each new topic, the journalist noticed how the conversation deepened. He increasingly realized that this wasn't just a traditional interview, but an opportunity to learn more about Sylvester as a person beyond the screen. "Sylvester," the journalist said, "you often take roles where your characters go through physical and emotional hardships. Are there moments in your life when you had to overcome inner barriers, just like your characters?" Sylvester paused for a moment, raising his eyebrows in a somewhat refined manner. "Absolutely," he replied with a slight smile. I don't think anyone goes through life without difficulties. We all have our moments of weakness. Sometimes, inner barriers are harder to overcome than any physical trials I've faced on screen. Think of those moments when you feel like you don't have the strength anymore. But like in the movies, you have to get up, move forward, and find the strength for the next step. The journalist watched intently, trying to decipher where the persona ended and the real Sylvester began. That's very deep. But do you have specific methods that help you overcome these internal struggles? How do you find your strength? I always tell myself to keep my head up, even when the world around me seems dark, Sylvester replied. My family, my brother, has always supported me. He's my rock. That's why I'm sure you can't go through life alone. If you have at least one close person who will always support you, you won't feel lonely in the hardest moments. The journalist, listening, realized that these moments of sincerity revealed a new side to Sylvester for the audience, who saw him as a hero, not just an actor. The next question he asked wasn't easy. You have countless devoted fans worldwide. How do you feel about the fact that sometimes fans see you not only as an actor, but as an ideal? Sylvester thought for a moment, tilting his head. The question seemed to touch the very depth of his personal feelings. It's a tough question, he replied, somewhat thoughtfully. I understand why people see me this way, especially after all those roles in the movies. But I can't be an ideal for anyone. I'm just a person, like everyone else, with my weaknesses and flaws. And I want people to understand, you shouldn't put anyone on a pedestal. We all have the right to make mistakes. The journalist felt that this answer had deeply touched him. It was yet another moment when Sylvester wasn't just telling his story, but opening up a part of himself for others. He decided to delve back into the topic of family. If you could go back to a certain period of your life, to your younger years, is there anything you would have done differently? You know, Sylvester smiled. I don't think I regret anything in my life. I believe that all mistakes are part of the journey that makes us who we are. I might have wanted more time with my family, with my children. Sometimes I miss those simple moments when we were all together and didn't think about the world outside the home. The journalist felt that this answer was important. He asked if Sylvester had any advice for those just starting their journey in life, or those going through a tough period. The advice I always give is, don't be afraid to be yourself. People try to follow other people's standards, compare themselves to others. But it's important to understand that your true self is your strength. If you try to be someone else, you'll lose yourself. And that's the worst thing you can do. He looked into the camera again, and his gaze was filled with conviction. The journalist could see that his words had truly moved people. It was clear that Sylvester had become more than just an actor to his audience. He had become an inspiration. And finally, Sylvester, what does true happiness mean to you? Happiness is when you can be close to those you love and do what brings you joy. It's not material things. It's those simple moments when you laugh with your family, when you feel peace in your soul. The journalist felt that this conversation with Sylvester was just the beginning of a great dialogue that had occurred not only on camera, but also in the hearts of all those who listened. The interview continued, and each new question posed by the journalist reflected a deeper level of understanding not only of Sylvester, but also of the essence of life, which often remains unnoticed by the public. Sylvester, you've often spoken about the importance of family, the support it gives you. But in your career, there have been many moments when you had to be far from home. How did you cope with that distance, with loneliness? The journalist asked, steering the conversation back to personal struggles. Sylvester sighed slightly, looking off into the distance, as if searching for an answer among his thoughts. It was hard, but I learned not to fear loneliness. Loneliness can be wonderful if you use it for reflection and self-discovery. In moments when you're far from home, all you have is yourself and your inner strength. He paused for a moment, perhaps recalling times when he had suffered from this loneliness. But in the end, it all depends on how you perceive the situation. You can see loneliness as an enemy or an opportunity for growth. I chose the latter. The journalist watched intently, captivated by his expression. This was a significant reflection of how Sylvester finds strength even in moments when it seems there's none left. But has there ever been a time when you felt exhausted by all of this? The journalist continued, trying to understand more. You always seem so strong, but are there moments when you feel you can't go on? Of course, Sylvester replied without hesitation. We're all human, and even the strongest people sometimes feel like they're on the edge. But it's important to know that it's temporary. It's important to know that after any fall, you can rise again. And once again, it's about your surroundings. When you have people who believe in you, it gives you strength. The journalist noticed how his tone had changed, becoming even more serious, more focused. And at that moment, as the conversation reached new depths, he realized that this interview felt more like a conversation between two people trying to understand each other, rather than just a typical media exchange. You repeatedly mentioned the support of those close to you. How do you see the role of your personal life in balancing your career and family? The journalist asked, trying to learn how this fits with such a demanding schedule. It's not easy, Sylvester replied, pausing. I've spent a lot of time working, and that definitely tests any relationship. But I understand that everything I do is for my loved ones, to provide them with a better life. And in the end, the most valuable thing in life is the time we spend together. He paused for a few seconds and then added, and although I worked a lot, I try not to forget that my children, my wife, they're the most important. They're what gives me the strength to keep going. The journalist was struck by this honesty. He understood that he wasn't just learning facts about Sylvester, but delving into the emotional depth of his life, which is not always visible to the public. This is a very important revelation. But you mentioned your children. How do you raise them? Do you have certain principles that guide you in parenting? The journalist asked, feeling that the conversation was taking a new direction. Sylvester smiled, and a warmth appeared on his face that you wouldn't see on screen. I always try to set an example for my children. They need to see how I approach hard work, how I respect others. And of course, it's important to teach them not to be afraid to be themselves. I always tell them, never be afraid to show your individuality. That's the most valuable thing I can give them. And although the conversation seemed to be drawing to a close, the journalist understood that in reality, this was just the beginning. He began to feel how every word, every gesture from Sylvester was opening a new part of not only his personality, but also of his inner world, unseen on screen. The interview was transforming into a shared journey into the depths of the human soul, continuing until people find the answer to the question that worries them. So, the journalist asked the last question, which had almost become rhetorical. Sylvester, if you could give one piece of advice to people who are going through tough times in life, what would you say to them? Don't give up, Sylvester replied, his eyes filled with genuine compassion. And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. Sometimes the strongest people are those who know how to ask for help. And that was the final word of this conversation, which continues in the hearts of all who listen. And even after the interview ends, it leaves the echo of deep reflections.